You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. It is Friday, May 3rd. I am Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell, and this is The Outcue. And this is a special edition of The Outcue, building off of this week's coverage, our third edition of 101 West, this time taking a look at the complicated and often misunderstood topic of human trafficking. We go way, way more in depth with the 101 West specials than you might in a normal newscast, but even then, there's more to discuss than what you can fit into a 30-minute broadcast. The outcue is the term for the last few words of a news story before it ends, because often what you see on television is only part of the story. Welcome to the Outcue, and with me today is the reporter for that episode, which is Sydney Canty. Sydney, thanks for being here.
Sure.
So, this is a bit of a loose discussion, but this was a heavy, heavy topic that we put in. When did we start working on this?
January 15th.
January. So we started working on this one before the last one even aired then, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to give you some idea, normally a news story is assigned in the morning and it's on the air by the evening. So it's an extraordinary amount of time. And the reason we wanted to put that much time into this is because there's a lot that people don't understand, and not just in the audience, but that we didn't understand. So I really just want to talk about what you learned along the way in exploring this topic, because it's broad. People say human trafficking all the time, but how often does anybody know what that really means?
Right. No, I learned so much along the way. There's so many common misconceptions, so many myths that are out there, things that needed to be debunked, that needed to be, dug up and really put a magnifying glass over to see what it was and what it wasn't. And I'd say one of the biggest things I learned is that trafficking was not your kids being snatched from a, parking lot, a Target parking lot, or being followed around. And, that was something that I spoke about with one of the experts that has an extended interview on our website right now, Dr. Tony Talbot from the University of Dayton. He talked about there are, people who have good intentions, but they're sharing that on Facebook saying this is what it looks like. I was that person. I did that. And we laugh about this because, he had to actually say something to me about it one time. And it's so many people don't know what it looks like.
And what we're talking about here is the common thing everybody's seen on Facebook, where it'll be, I was walking around the store and I believe I was almost trafficked because there was somebody following me around and they were in every aisle and they had this look about them, and then I was in the parking lot. Or sometimes it'll be, I heard about someone who was they were going to their car and there was something on their windshield and it smeared it, and then the van comes up and snatches them. This very kind of Hollywood movie idea.
Right.
Of these networks of shadowy characters. So that's our jumping off point here, is there's some truth. There are shadowy networks of very, very ill-intentioned people, and they're probably operating right in front of you, aren't they?
Right. Yes, that's what it's not, like you said, the people in the parking lots, doesn't look like the movie Taken, doesn't look like Sound of Freedom or any of those things. It is hidden in plain sight, though, right in front of you. And, a lot of times it's hard for us to identify because not only do the victims not know sometimes that they're victims, they think that this is a way of life. They think that this is a lifestyle. This is what I need to do in order to survive, to keep a roof over my head. But they're tethered to the person that is actually causing them this abuse, that Stockholm syndrome kind of mindset. And so just to really unpack all of that, Justin, was a lot. To hear it from the mouth of one of the victims, and how she, even after she escaped, still didn't know that she had been a victim of human trafficking. She thought she was just in a domestic violence situation until, she was on social media one day and somebody made a post that said, "You may have been trafficked if," and she said she checked everything off of the list and was like, oh my God, I was trafficked.
So how, that's something I know that is very hard to wrap your head around for anybody, is how could you not know? And it's largely because you might, whether the person trafficking you is somebody you've known your whole life or somebody you came to know because they sought to traffic you, they didn't grab you off the street. They forged a relationship with you. They made you trust them. So you mentioned the victim that you spoke to, and actually, and this was something that there's always things that you don't get to fit in. There were several victims you spoke to, many of whom are so, whether the word is scarred or traumatized, or quite frankly worried about the stigma that their story could follow because of people sort of writing human trafficking victims off far too often as people with criminal records, drug addicts, prostitutes. There's a stigma there that really is reminiscent of what we've seen with other crises in the past, whether it be the addiction crisis or, you know, going back decades, there was a certain stigma attached to the AIDS crisis that had to be overcome. So what are these people like when you break through to them? What's it like talking to them, and how do you make a connection so that you see beyond what society sees?
It is it's a very, very delicate process. You have to be understanding of the fact that this person has lived through things that are unimaginable. And so when I found the victim, her name is Rachel Socorro, she was already pretty outspoken about the situation that she had come through, the trafficking situation. She was trafficked for 15 years, and she has a nonprofit now to help other victims of human trafficking. So she was a little bit, just a little bit easier to get to talk on camera about her story, but she says that she had never once gone as far in depth about her story anywhere else as she did with me. So when I went to her house and I went to talk to her, it was very, very hard. Anytime if I touched on something that was too much, too sensitive, she would literally have to withdraw and just stop. There was a time, Justin, in the middle of the interview where she had to stop, get up, go and cry, get herself together, and then come back and sit down and finish the interview. That was really, really tough because I felt like, oh my, am I reopening this wound for this woman? But she was so, no, this needs to be out there. This needs to be told. I want to help somebody so that no one else goes through this. And I just had to be very, very delicate, very, hey, you take your time. You tell me what you want me to know. I don't want to go too deep or too far. And, you know, to even sit there and to listen to the things that she said she lived through, how, you know, she was held captive and pistol whipped and had her identity basically stolen and, you know, isolated from her family. And then to have to see her stop so she can go and cry about it after she's been removed from it already for years. That was just really hard.
And it's important, though, right? I mean, to walk that line. And these are people who, you know, the last time they trusted somebody, that was a bad, you know, that led to a really dark road.
Right.
So it's hard for them to even trust you to tell their story. So how do you approach that? How do you let them know? What's your attitude towards them, and what do you observe and why is it important?
So a lot of times I try to find a common ground when I have to talk to victims. So this is not the first victim-centered story I've had to do. I've had to talk to, you know, family members who lost people to gun violence or to some other horrible situation. And so when I go and I talk to people in an awful situation, I try to find a common ground with them. I try to connect with them on something, relate to them on something so that they feel comfortable enough that they can trust me, that they can talk to me. So whether that's just being kind to them, because kindness pretty much works on anyone, or whether that's just, you know, hey, we have cultural similarities if we're, you know, both African American or whatever it is, or if that's a religious type of thing. The woman I talked to, Rachel Socorro, was very, Jesus did this and Jesus helped me with that and I prayed about this and I prayed about, so I knew that I could connect with her on that level, and that helped me to kind of get in with her, not as a tactic, but just as a how can I relate to her as a human being. And that, you know, I had an opening there because, you know, we're both, you know, we believe the same things. So it really just comes down to finding a way that you can connect with whoever it is that you need to talk to on a human level. And
in an honest way. You can't fake that. That's
right, exactly.
We've talked about that. I mean, you and I have talked about that on a previous edition of the Outcue that had a similar storyline where you can't, people will see through being disingenuous right away. They know when somebody's just sort of being a vulture to try and tell a salacious story. So how is this different, though? This is not a salacious story.
Right.
We want to tell her story not because we want viewers to say, oh my God, look at that.
Right.
It's got some value.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets back to the misunderstanding, doesn't it? People don't know what they should be looking for. Or, you know, people, often there is a fundamental goodness in a lot of people. They want to help.
Mm-hmm.
No idea how to help something you don't understand.
Right.
So, I mean, I want to talk about Rachel, but I also want to talk about what the lack of understanding is in the system.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you find there? Because you spoke to experts. You mentioned Dr. Talbot.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel Melman Orozco is that's her name, right? Kimberly. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Kimberly Melman Orozco is a national expert. But then also people right on the street level here in the Valley who have seen it here in various incarnations, and they all readily admitted that they'd probably seen it a lot longer than they realized and missed it entirely, right?
Right. You know, absolutely. So a lot of this, what I learned talking to all of these people, most of them really talked about how these victims are so classified as prostitutes. And that's actually what got the ball rolling with, you know, finding this story when Barbara Freeman, a trafficking survivor who was trafficked out of Columbus, started telling her story at a Martin Luther King Day event. And, you know, I was there for a totally different reason, but her story was so captivating. It literally took my mind completely off of the story I was there to do. And I focused on her and what she was saying. And when she said I was arrested 33 times, treated as a prostitute and a criminal every one of those times, except for the very last one when that officer asked me what happened, not like what happened, why are you here, but more like, what happened to you? How did you come to be here? She said, he showed me that he cared about me. And then he spoke life into me. And that is what led me down the path to freedom. So that's when I was like, how often does that happen here? You know, how often are they looked at as prostitutes instead of victims? I didn't even know truly what human trafficking was before we started to research this and dig and investigate. And so when I went to talk to judges and law enforcement officers that are undercover and, you know, all the experts I spoke to, I brought that situation to them. And, you know, I asked them about it and they said, yeah, historically, that's what it's been. They have always been looked at as prostitutes. They've always been looked at as criminals and always were prosecuted as if they were not victims themselves, forced to do what they were doing and that they didn't really have a choice.
And so I made the analogy earlier where I talked about previous crises, and what I have seen in one of the more recent ones is the opioid crisis, where you saw a similar dynamic where for a long time you saw mugshots of people charged with drug crimes. And eventually, slowly, we started to get to a point where we realized that there's just no way that's a life somebody wants to lead. There's something steering this. Now, in that case, it's the way that the mechanics of addiction and how powerful of a grip that is. And now we've made some progress. I think people's attitudes are maybe at least a little better than they were 7-8 years ago. Do you think, from the people you've spoken to and the victims and those in positions of authority, that we're beginning to have a similar awakening that we may have been going about this all wrong, or we still have a long way to go?
I'd say it's both. Absolutely, there are some changes in the way that things are done and the way that these victims are seen in the eyes of law enforcement and in the eyes of the courts. We've been able to see evidence of that in the Grace Court that is new, just has been around no more than maybe 4 years, you know, and there's only been 2 graduates of that so far. And that's, you know, for the viewers who don't know, Grace Court is it's a program that allows human trafficking victims to be rehabilitated, and it's here in Youngstown at the Municipal Court under Judge Renee DeSalvo. So that's new. The Human Trafficking Task Force was formed in 2018. That really wasn't that long ago when you think about it. And so for there to be this new awareness, this new, okay, these programs are coming out, this task force was formed, some of them get together and they try to go do crackdowns around the state. That's stuff that we're hearing more about now that I feel like we weren't hearing about 10, 20 years ago. But there is still a long way to go, because even in the justice system, victims of human trafficking are still being prosecuted.
Sure.
They're still being prosecuted. So,
and this was something that that Dr. Talbot had mentioned.
Yes.
Is that he was advocating, I think that's the right word. I mean, he was for this, right? He wasn't just throwing it out as an idea. He was advocating for sort of a partial decriminalization where the sale of sex would not be illegal, but the buying of it would be. The idea being that you'd go after the demand instead of the person being forced into it, sort of similar to going after a drug trafficker and getting an addict into rehab, as opposed to throwing everybody in jail and letting it all sort itself out.
Right. And he said that was something that we continue to see, where prostitutes were repeatedly thrown into jail and then they were let back out and they were arrested again and let back out. And some of them, somewhere along the way, because they weren't getting the help that they needed, would die off from drug addiction or from extreme abuse, being beaten or shot or whatever by the traffickers. And so what he pushed for and lobbied for was that partial decriminalization model. And he feels like that model would deter or diminish the demand for trafficking or for, you know, people who want to go out and have sex. They call them the Johns that are seeking it out.
And those people may or may not recognize, so there's all this understanding, those people may or may not recognize what they're feeding into.
Right.
You know, there is a discussion about prostitution as essentially a victimless crime, and there is an argument to be made for that when you're talking about strictly commercial sex work. But what they may not understand is that often what you're finding on this illicit market is not going to a Nevada brothel here. This is somebody who's being forced into it, and you will not see the signs of that because the people who are pulling the strings, you may never see. I've worked in news a lot of years, and I can't recall a case, maybe I can recall one or two, where somebody up here has been prosecuted or ever even really found because of the way they insulate themselves from the people that are making the money for them.
And you know what? That even, Justin, plays into the invisible chains, part of this piece that we put together. A lot of times, and I was being told this by two undercover officers from the Mahoning Valley Human Trafficking Task Force, they say a lot of times it's hard to get the guy that's all the way up here, because even if they find out who he is and what he's done, a lot of the times the human trafficking charge is victim-centered. So if the victim has that Stockholm syndrome that we talked about earlier and is attached to this guy and tethered to this guy and afraid of this guy, she's not going to she's not going to testify against him. And so he gets to walk free or have a lesser charge.
Well, and even beyond that, even if they do, because obviously we found a few victims, or at least one victim that was willing to speak out publicly. So theoretically, you can sometimes get a victim to speak out.
Right.
But even if you do that, you also need evidence. It's not enough to have one person saying this happened.
Right.
And they really, what we found here that was fascinating to me is how they really obscure the evidence. I mean, in the case of Rachel Socorro, so much of the money, if you followed the trail, it would lead back to her, because things were in her name.
Right.
So in the eyes of the law, she's the kingpin, right?
Yes. And that's another reason she didn't even want to go after her own trafficker in court. Number one, she didn't want to rehash the wound and open that up. That's hard enough for a lot of these victims, which is why it's hard to get a conviction on this. But then secondly, how can you really prove exactly what happened to you? There has been a habit. Dr. Kimberly Melman-Orozco, the Washington National Expert for Human Trafficking, told me that a lot of these times these traffickers are very, very smart, and they can flip the situation around on the victim. No, you did this. You put that out on the internet. You sold yourself, when really they were forced to do it. But how can you prove that they were forced to do it?
If everything's in their name, right? It all leads back to them.
Yes.
And so now, not only do they need the bravery to face down the trafficker, but they have to know that there will be a defense mounted for that trafficker, and oftentimes that defense will involve some pretty brutal tactics against them.
Right.
So they will, this stigmatization will be dramatically amplified, where now not only is it, I need to have the courage to face this person down, but the entire legal system is going to call my character into question, and now they're going to do it publicly.
Yes.
And my face might be on television, which leads me to the next point I want to make, and one that we didn't touch on in 101 West, but its very existence is this point, which is, what role can we play as communicators to the public here? I've seen some evolution. I used to see stories where I saw prostitutes arrested. There were mugshots. They weren't big stories, but they were based on police reports. There was nothing, legally or arguably ethically wrong with them if you don't understand, but you're just reporting on what the law is. I can tell you that if I know somebody's working on a story like that, I'm stopping them. What's in that report? There's a lot more knowledge of the situation and how deep it may go. So how can we help educate people continuously, and what habits do we need to change, we, not just as a station, but as the media at every level, to help people better understand this?
I would say I'm going to jump to the how we can help the community part first.
Sure.
Because asking questions, that if you don't get anything else from this, ask questions. If you see that something maybe is off, if you feel like maybe something is off, and if you can safely get in there and ask a question, ask. That's what set Rachel free. Some girl asked her a question. You own that house? You own those cars? Go home and take your life back. Yes. And change her life completely from a conversation. Got her free from a conversation. The same thing happened with Barbara Freeman, the Columbus trafficking victim. What happened to you? Ask the question. Set her free. So I would say, just talk to people. If you feel like something's off, definitely ask a question and see if you can help somebody just with a conversation. Even if that person can't be set free on their own, maybe you can say, hey, I talked to this person. This is what I got from this. Mahoning County Sheriff's Office, Human Trafficking Hotline, whoever you need to call to maybe get that person some help. You never know. You never know how that can turn out. The other part of the question was...
Well, it's broader. We obviously have a role where we speak to a lot of people. Right. I think of it as there are certain premises that we as a society and we as an industry accept and then work from. And I'm a big proponent of rejecting those sometimes. Sometimes they're outdated. Sometimes we need to evolve our thinking. So what premises do we need to reject in the way we think about these stories? For example, we go through a lot of police reports. I see a police report, or somebody writing a web story sees a police report that essentially amounts to a woman charged charged with prostitution or charged with solicitation in some kind of a sting operation. Now, for many, many years, a lot of news organizations, they would simply write that police report up. They'd get the mugshot, they'd write the details in the report, they'd write what the charges were, and that's it. How's that got to evolve? That's still happening.
Yeah.
How do we change attitudes?
They're not prostitutes. Most of them are not prostitutes. So don't just look at them and judge them like, I'm just going to be real here, Justin. Oh, she's some whore. No, sure. They're not. They're regular people that are forced to do this. So I would say don't immediately judge them. Maybe tune your eyes to, is something else going on here? Something Lynn Morrow said, one of the attorneys that I had in this piece, said if there's a child that's a troubled child at school, acting out, maybe a runaway, disrespect or whatever, don't just, oh, that's just a troubled child. Change your thinking a little bit. Maybe what's going on here? What else could be at play here? Because a lot of times something is actually wrong. And so I feel like we could definitely change our mindsets when it comes to that. Also, this isn't a choice for them. So try to help, I guess, where you can. I don't want to tell anybody to go rogue and be a, I'm going to go save, No, you're not going to save anybody, directly yourself, but it's attitude. Yes, definitely change the attitude. Change the way that you're thinking about the situation, the way you're seeing the situation. Even try to educate yourself if you can. A lot of times things happen, things slip through the cracks because you lacked knowledge somewhere.
Sure.
If you could, educate yourself a little bit more on what it looks like with what the signs, subtle signs maybe could be. I feel like that.
I mean, for me, what I'm thinking is because a lot of what you're saying is for sort of the news consumer who's hearing about these things. And I'm now thinking also, though, in terms of the news, the content creators, like what we do. There are stories that we may need to rethink about how we tell. For instance, that police report I referred to. There are cases where maybe we shouldn't report on it at all. But there are other ways we can think about these, and none of these are going to ever be black and white because it's always going to be the details of the story. And there will be times where there is a newsworthiness to it. There will be times where they're not. But also, I think that in general, journalists need to consider if they're asking the right questions, and maybe just writing from the police report and the charges is something that we all need to do a little bit better of a job about. Are there extenuating circumstances here? Who can we ask about that? Should we do this story based upon what we have now because we can, or should we wait until we get some of these questions answered?
Right.
What's the public need in this story now, and does it outweigh what it could be if I could get these other questions answered? Like, are they asking her about her circumstances? Is there anybody else involved? What's the background? And also not just relying necessarily on courts, prosecutors, and police, because there are laws on the books and they have to be enforced, whether or not there is change that may be coming down the road. So I guess I'm asking you to reflect on that a little bit. Any other, can you add to that at all, what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would say, so what I got from you, even while you were asking the question, was like, be human. You know, maybe take off the journalist hat for a second, because the journalist is going to look at the facts and just write the facts. Maybe take off the journalist hat for a second and just ask, like, okay, what else? Hey, chief, whoever, what do I need to know here? Talk to me. I don't want to put anybody in a position that makes it play out as X, Y, and Z, and it looks bad, and blah, because I wrote down the facts that I saw here. Talk to me from a human perspective. What is going on here? Who will be affected? You know, just, I guess, kind of looking at it with different eyes, softer eyes.
Well, and I mean, a couple points I would add to that is, like, I mean, you mentioned chief, you know, whoever, but law enforcement attitudes obviously have to change too.
Yeah.
Some are better than others. The ones that you've spoken to for this story had certainly evolved their thinking a lot. I can certainly think of others I've spoken to who have a lot of work to do still in that front. So they aren't the ones that are necessarily the arbiters, because it's not their story to tell, but they are somebody to ask. And you mentioned taking the journalist hat off. I would even elaborate on that. It's keeping the journalist hat on and remembering what a journalist does, which is not just regurgitate what's handed to them, but asks questions, right? Conversations. So what a journalist does has to, I think, rise to another level. It is very easy and barely journalism to just simply write what's in a police report and on a court docket. That I could teach a high school kid to do that, and they could probably do it with some accuracy. I mean, I don't think they'd struggle too much. It's, once you know what you're reading, it's fairly easy, right?
Right.
Knowing what to ask, knowing what to think about. And the other element of a journalist is, what purpose am I serving here? Ultimately, we're in public service, right? So what's the public service in what I have in front of me versus if I could get these questions answered and have either a better story, or in some cases not tell the story because I can't get those answers and I might be doing some harm by putting half the story out there.
Yeah, doing a disservice in that way.
So those are the kinds of things that I think that we as an industry need to continue to think about. And obviously that's where our heads are, or we wouldn't have just done this special, but that's scratching the surface. This is as far as we've ever gone with this.
Yes, right.
So, and we've touched on a lot of this, but just to conclude, from January to now, what are the major things that you learned that just you had no idea about?
Does this go like just in trafficking, or as just a journalist period, or
In this whole experience, like since you started working on this story, you have an understanding of what that you didn't before?
I have an understanding of what trafficking, human trafficking, actually is. I can see it now, especially now that I've been able to see it through the eyes of someone who was there. I learned how brutal it can really be. I learned also how brutal our justice system can be on these victims, which also makes me wonder about other things. Wow, what else have we missed?
Yes.
How else, where else is something like this going on, even if it's not in the realm of trafficking? Who else is being maybe disserviced by the justice system that is supposed to be a service, to the people? So I learned that. I also And I knew this a little bit because I had talked to other victims, like I said before, but a different level of delicate, sensitive, understanding. Because at one point, if I saw somebody walk in the streets somewhere at night, I probably would have thought too, like, oh, it's just she's out here prostituting, or he's out here, that's what I would. And so I learned, even as a human, to just have more understanding, to not immediately jump to what it looks like with my eyes, and to dig a little bit deeper, try to really see what's going on here. It was mind blowing to hear her story and the several others that I couldn't broadcast.
No, and I like what you said about wondering about what other areas we don't understand, because that right there, that is what makes you a better journalist for having done this story, because you will now bring that to other topics. And I hope that that is also translates to the viewer, that they will think about other things through a different lens. I often have said that people talk about common sense, and I kind of jokingly say I'm anti-common sense. I'm not anti-common sense really, but what I mean is that the common sense usually means the basic surfacey answer. Just go with that. Don't. And it's usually a lot more complicated. Almost everything is more complicated than that. What you think of as that common sense answer is just what's black and white in front of you. It's what you see with your eyes, and it's not asking a lot of questions. Unless there's anything else you want to add, I think that we could go on for hours talking about this and the state of journalism and where we need to head. But is there any concluding words you'd like to add?
Do not share things on Facebook unless you know that they're true. I do, because
or Justin Mitchell will come and get you.
Justin Mitchell will have something to say. No, seriously, just I loved this experience. So thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to be able to walk through this.
Well, thank you for delivering and buying into this and taking it to the level that we took it. And we will continue to do this kind of work for as long as you'll have us. And as always, any topics you want us to explore in depth, or just you see something on your way to work that you think we need to get a camera to, news@wfmj.com, watchdog@wfmj.com. Our newsroom number is 330-744-8821. And any other way you can message us on Facebook. We are always here. We are always looking to do the work that people need done. We're here for you, and we're here for good. That does it for this week's edition of the Outcue. I thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.